The gun was already pressed against Nelson Hadley's temple when Charlotte Brenner walked through the saloon doors. She did not scream. She did not freeze. She looked at the man holding the weapon, a broad-shouldered cattle baron named Silas Drummond with cold eyes and a colder reputation, and she said very quietly, "Put it down, Silas. Whatever he owes you, I will pay it." Nelson felt the barrel tremble against his skin, not because Drummond's hand was shaking, because Nelson himself had stopped breathing. He had not expected anyone to walk through that door. He had not expected anyone to care. He had stopped expecting things like that a long time ago, in the same quiet way that a man stops expecting rain after years of drought. You do not grieve the absence of water when you have forgotten what it tastes like. "You will pay it," Drummond repeated, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man who believed all debts were simply a question of leverage. "With what exactly, Miss Brenner? You have not got $1 to your name since your father ran that stagecoach into a ravine." The words were designed to humiliate her. Nelson watched Charlotte's jaw tighten, watched something flash across her gray eyes, not shame, never shame with a woman like her, but fury. A clean, purposeful fury that had nowhere to go but forward. "I have the land deed to my father's property outside Caldwell," she said. 212 acres with water rights to the creek. That is worth considerably more than whatever this man owes you. He owes me $600, interest included. Then you are getting the better end of this arrangement. Put the gun down." There was a silence in the saloon that felt like the pause before lightning touches the earth. Every man in the room, gamblers, drifters, ranch hands drinking away their wages, held perfectly still. Nelson Hadley, a man who had faced down rattlesnakes and bank robbers and the slow cruelty of an indifferent frontier, found that what he could not face was the expression on Charlotte Brenner's face as she stood between him and certain death without flinching. He had said goodbye to every good thing that came his way. He was not going to say it this time. Drummond lowered the gun. That moment, that one terrifying and luminous moment, was the end of one chapter of Nelson Hadley's life and the absolute beginning of another. But to understand why it broke him open the way it did, you have to go back. You have to go back to the summer of 1882, to the flat yellow plains outside Caldwell, Kansas, where the wind never stopped, and the sky was so enormous it made a man feel like a mistake. Nelson Hadley had come to Caldwell the way most men came to frontier towns, by necessity, without ceremony, carrying a past he had not found a way to leave behind. He was 29 years old that summer, lean and sun-darkened, with hands that showed every fence post he had ever driven, every horse he had ever broken, every fight he had walked away from, and every one he had not. He had grown up in Missouri, the youngest of 3 brothers, on a farm that produced more grief than corn. His father had been a hard man, not cruel in the theatrical way of villains in dime novels, but hard in the grinding, ordinary way of men who have given up on gentleness and call it strength. His oldest brother, James, had died at Pea Ridge during the war, not in the heroic way that made mothers proud, but in the muddy, senseless way that wars actually kill people. His middle brother, Frank, had come home from that same war changed in ways that had no name in polite company, and had drunk himself into an early grave by 1876. Nelson had buried them both. He had said goodbye to both of them, standing over the raw earth with his hat in his hands, feeling the same thing he always felt at goodbyes, that inevitable, familiar loosening in his chest, like a not giving way, like something important coming untethered. He had also said goodbye to a woman named Grace Alderley in 1879, who had loved him with everything she had, and whom he had loved back with the same reckless completeness, only to watch her die of scarlet fever on a Tuesday morning in October, while the maple trees outside the window blazed red and gold and obscenely beautiful. He had held her hand while she went. He had said goodbye to her in a voice that barely worked. He had walked out of that house and ridden west and kept riding, because west was where you went when east had taken everything from you. That was the shape of Nelson Hadley by the time he reached Caldwell. A man made of goodbyes. A man who had learned, through accumulated grief that would have broken a lesser person, that caring about things was simply a way of arranging future suffering. He did not think of himself as closed or cold. He thought of himself as practical. He took work as a ranch hand on a property belonging to a man named George Brenner, an affable, reckless Irishman who laughed too loudly and gambled too freely and spoke about his late wife with a tenderness that Nelson found both beautiful and painful to witness. George Brenner had a daughter. Nelson had heard about Charlotte Brenner before he ever met her. The ranch hands talked about her the way people talk about weather, as something that affected everything around it, that could not be bargained with, that arrived on its own schedule. She was 24, they said. She had been educated back east at a school in St. Louis and had come home when her mother died 3 years prior to help her father manage the property. She rode better than any man on the payroll. She kept the accounts. She had once turned down a marriage proposal from a territorial judge, politely but firmly, and the judge in question had not recovered his dignity for some months afterward. Nelson had filed all of this information away without particular interest. He was not in the market for anything that might eventually require a goodbye. He met her on a Wednesday morning in late June when he was repairing the fence along the south pasture, working methodically in the heat, his shirt soaked through and his focus entirely on the wire he was stretching. She rode up on a dark roan mare, stopped 20 feet away, and looked at him for a moment before speaking. "You are the new hand," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am," he said without stopping work. "Nelson Hadley." "I know your name," she said. "My father told me." "He also told me you worked the Ellsworth Drive 2 years running, and that you have never been caught stealing cattle, which he considers a significant virtue." Nelson straightened and looked at her for the first time. She was not what he had expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had expected. She had dark red hair pulled back severely from a face that was angular and intelligent, gray eyes that were doing a rapid and apparently thorough assessment of him, and a quality about her stillness that made him think of a hawk on a fence post, perfectly composed, entirely ready to move. "Your father is generous with his references," Nelson said. "He is generous with everything," Charlotte said, and there was something in her tone, a shading of worry beneath the surface, that caught his attention despite himself. "Sometimes to a fault." "Is the fence along the east pasture holding? I noticed the third post from the oak tree was leaning badly last week." "I have not gotten to the east pasture yet," Nelson said. "I will tomorrow." "I would appreciate it today if possible," she said, with no particular emphasis, in the tone of a woman who was used to saying things once and having them heard. Then she turned the roan and rode back toward the house, and Nelson Hadley stood in the hammering June sun and looked after her and felt, for the first time in 3 years, something that was not grief or numbness or the blank forward motion of survival. He felt curious. He told himself it was nothing. He fixed the east fence that afternoon. The summer arranged itself around work and heat, and the ordinary rhythms of a working cattle ranch in Kansas in 1882. Nelson learned the property quickly, its 3 water sources, its problem areas along the northern boundary where another rancher named Drummond perpetually pushed cattle over the fence line, its good grazing sections and its rocky ones. He worked hard because he had always worked hard. He kept his distance from the other hand's social activities. The Saturday trips into Caldwell for drink and cards, not out of any particular virtue, but because saloons had begun to feel to him like places where you ran into yourself in mirrors and did not like what you saw. He saw Charlotte Brenner every day. That was simply the nature of the place. She was everywhere. The work was checking accounts at the kitchen table while he and the foreman discussed schedules on the porch, riding the fence lines herself when there was not enough labor to cover everything, negotiating at the feed store in town with a precision that made the storekeeper visibly uncomfortable. She was not warm with him exactly. She was direct and fair, and occasionally something that might have been wry, if you were paying close enough attention to notice when the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was almost a smile. He was paying close enough attention. That was the problem. There was an evening in late July, a Saturday, when most of the hands had gone into town, and the ranch was quiet in the way that it only got when the cicadas took over the ambient sound and the light went golden and long. Nelson was at the water pump behind the barn washing the day off himself when Charlotte came around the corner with a lantern already lit, clearly heading somewhere, and stopped when she saw him. "I am sorry," she said immediately, looking away. "I thought everyone had gone." "Nearly everyone," he said, reaching for his shirt. "I do not much care for town on Saturday nights." "Nor do I," she said, which surprised him. He would have thought a woman like her would have social obligations aplenty. She seemed to read his expression because she added, "People ask me about my father's financial situation in ways they think are subtle but are not, and I find I would rather spend the evening with my own company." He buttoned his shirt. She had looked back at him by then, composed again, the lantern making warm light against the side of her face. "Is it bad?" he asked. His situation. It was a forward question. He had not planned it. She looked at him for a moment as though deciding something. "It is not good," she said. "He has mortgaged the north pasture against a loan from Drummond's bank, and I do not believe Drummond extended that loan out of neighborly feeling. Drummond has wanted this land since before I was born. What does your father say?" Something moved across her face that he recognized, the expression of a person who has had a conversation too many times and got nowhere. "My father says everything will be fine," she said. Nelson nodded slowly. "And you?" "I say we have until spring to find a solution before the balloon payment comes due, and that I intend to find one." She said it without drama, with the matter-of-fact determination of someone who has decided to outrun a disaster rather than be stopped by it. He believed her. That was the strange thing. He looked at her in the lantern light and believed her completely. "If there is anything I can do," he said, and stopped, because the offer felt too large for the context, too much like something a different version of himself might say. She looked at him with those clear gray eyes and said, "Keep the fences in order and the cattle counted. That is sufficient." But she said it in a way that meant something more, something like "thank you," and Nelson Hadley walked back to the bunkhouse that night feeling as though the ground under his feet had shifted slightly and quietly to the left. He lay on his bunk in the dark and had a very deliberate conversation with himself. She was the rancher's daughter. He was a hired hand with $6 to his name beyond his wages, a history of loss that would fill a book, and a well-established habit of destroying his own happiness through inaction disguised as stoicism. She was the kind of woman who made plans and executed them. He was the kind of man who fixed fences and moved on. There was nothing here to entertain, nothing here to hope for. He went asleep. He did not entirely believe himself. August arrived with a heat that felt personal. The grass in the south pasture went brown and crackly underfoot, and the creek dropped to a thin, apologetic trickle, and the cattle grew irritable in the way of living things that are uncomfortable and cannot explain why. Nelson worked through it without complaint. He had a constitution that seemed designed for endurance, not the showy, explosive endurance of a man proving something, but the quiet, reliable endurance of someone who simply continues because stopping has not occurred to him. One afternoon in the second week of August, he was moving a group of cattle that had broken through the south fence. The third time in 2 weeks the Drummond hands had clearly cut the wire on their way through, when he came across Charlotte already there, alone, working to push the strays back through the gap. She was hot and annoyed, and her hair had come half loose from its pins, and she was talking to the cattle in a low, firm voice that suggested she was running low on patience with everyone and everything. He rode up beside her without comment and started working the cattle from the other side. They worked together for 20 minutes in silence, moving the animals back through, and she mended the wire herself with practiced efficiency while he held the post steady. When it was done, she pushed her hair back from her face with one forearm and looked at the repaired fence with an expression of controlled frustration. "That is the third time," Nelson said. "I know," she said. "Drummond's men." "Yes." She turned to look at him, and there was something raw and tired underneath the composure for just a moment. He wants us to make a mistake, to miss something, to have a bad quarter, to give him grounds to accelerate the note. He is a patient man, Drummond. He does not need to win quickly. He only needs to win. He has not won yet, Nelson said. She looked at him. There was a quality to her gaze, direct, searching, that made him want to look away and also made it completely impossible to do so. No, she said softly. He has not. Something happened in that moment, something that neither of them acknowledged or named, but that was nonetheless completely real, like a key being turned in a lock that neither party intended to approach. Nelson felt it the way you feel a change in weather, not dramatically, but everywhere at once, in the skin and the lungs and the back of the neck. He rode back to the barn. He did not speak to her again that evening. He was very careful not to think too directly about what had happened. He thought about it constantly. September came and the heat broke in the way that Kansas heat breaks, not gradually but all at once, overnight, so that you wake up and the world has transformed while you were sleeping. The mornings came cool and the evenings came cold, and the light went from white to gold to something more amber and regretful, the light of a summer that knows it is ending. George Brenner came home from a trip to Wichita in the first week of September in a state that Nelson recognized immediately, because he had seen it before in men who had received bad news and were processing it in the most destructive available way. He was drunk. He had been drunk for some time. He climbed down from the buggy with the exaggerated care of a man managing uncertain footing, and he said something to Charlotte, who was standing on the porch, that Nelson could not hear from across the yard. He saw her face change. He found out later, from the foreman, that George Brenner had gone to Wichita to try to arrange refinancing on the mortgage, to find another lender who might buy out Drummond's note and give them terms they could manage. He had found no one willing to take the risk. He had come home with the news that Drummond's note would come due in March, and there was nothing in the accounts to meet it. Charlotte was in the barn the next morning before anyone else was up, checking the tack and probably thinking, Nelson recognized, the same way a chess player thinks, several moves ahead, mapping possibilities, discarding the ones that do not work. He came in for his horse and found her there and stopped. "Is there anything I can do?" he said again, and this time he did not cut the offer short. She turned from the saddle she had been examining and looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her before, something open and unmistakably afraid, quickly controlled but present. He was glad she did not hide it. He would have felt further away from her if she had. "My father," she said carefully, "borrowed money from Drummond because Drummond offered terms that seemed reasonable at the time, and because my father has always believed that things will work out in the end. He believes this the way some men believe in God, sincerely and without requiring evidence." She set the saddle down. "I have been going through the accounts. If we sell the North herd and get a fair price in Abilene, which requires getting them there before the market turns, which means leaving in 2 weeks, we can cover perhaps $400 of the shortfall. That leaves $200 I do not have." Nelson thought about this. "The Abilene market," he said. "I drove cattle to Abilene in '79. I know the route." "I know you do," she said. "That is why I am telling you." He looked at her for a long moment. "You want me to run the drive?" "I want you to help me run it," she corrected, with a precision that he had come to expect and quietly admire. "I will be going myself. My father is not in a condition to manage it, and I will not send a herd worth our last chance on the road without someone I trust at the front of it." The word trust landed on him with unexpected weight. "All right," he said. She nodded once, and there was relief in it, carefully contained. "We leave Monday." The drive to Abilene was 11 days through country that did not care about deadlines or financial urgency, or the particular knot of anxiety that lived in Charlotte Brenner's chest, and that she carried with the same competent silence with which she carried everything else. Nelson watched her over those 11 days with an attention that he no longer bothered to deny to himself, even if he denied it in every other available direction. She was extraordinary on the trail. He had known capable women before. The frontier produced them necessarily, because soft conditions produced softness and hard conditions produced otherwise. But Charlotte had something beyond capability, a quality of focused intelligence applied to practical problems that made everything around her run more efficiently simply by her being present. She read the cattle. She read the sky. She read the men knew when to push and when to let rest, when a hand needed encouragement, and when he needed to be ignored so his pride could recover in private. She also occasionally, when the work allowed it and the evening fire was going and the cattle were settled, simply talked to Nelson. Not about the drive or the accounts or Drummond or the mortgage. About other things. About the books she had read in St. Louis. She had a particular passion for natural history that surprised him. About the way the prairie looked different in different lights. About her mother, who had been a musician and who had died too young and whose absence Charlotte carried the way Nelson carried his own losses, quietly, continuously, as part of the body's permanent weather. He told her, one night when the fire was low and the others were asleep, about Grace Alderley. He had not talked about Grace to anyone since her death. He heard himself saying Grace's name, and something shifted in the air between him and Charlotte that was completely quiet and completely significant. Charlotte said, "I am sorry," with a simplicity that made the words larger rather than smaller. "She was a good woman," Nelson said. "I know she must have been," Charlotte said. "Or you would not have loved her the way that is still visible on your face when you speak of her." She said it without pity, with a kind of clear-eyed recognition that did not flinch from the truth of it. He looked at her across the fire and felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed for 3 years. He did not say anything. She did not press. They sat in the dark with the sounds of the sleeping cattle around them, and it was one of the most intimate silences of Nelson Hadley's life. They arrived in Abilene on the 12th day, and Charlotte negotiated the sale of the cattle herself, at a price that made the buyer argue, and that she obtained anyway through a combination of preparation and an absolute refusal to be moved that Nelson found, frankly, astonishing. She got $3.40 per head above the opening offer. She counted the money in the office of the cattle broker, noted the total, and allowed herself exactly one full breath of relief before folding the bills carefully and putting them away. $462, she told Nelson as they walked out into the Abilene street, which smelled of cattle and dust, and the particular industrial efficiency of a town that existed entirely to process beef. "Better than 400, he said. "Considerably," she agreed. And she smiled at him, a real one, unguarded, a smile that reached the gray eyes and transformed her whole face, and that Nelson Hadley immediately understood was something he would carry in his memory for the rest of his life regardless of what happened next. He wanted to say something. He could feel it there, something true and large and important, pressing at the back of his teeth. He thought about Grace and about James and about Frank and about the particular shape that goodbye left in a person, not the event of it but the architecture of loss, the way it restructured everything around the absence until you became a person built around holes rather than around presences. He said, "We should start back tomorrow. Weather looks like it could turn." She looked at him for a moment, the smile still fading rather than gone, and said, "Yes, tomorrow is fine." They rode back to the ranch in 9 days because they were not trailing cattle and they pushed the pace. The weather held. They talked more on the return, easier now, something having shifted between them in Abilene, some formality having been set down at the same time as the grief about Grace, left in the dirt at the fire ring like something that was no longer necessary to carry. Nelson told her about Missouri, about his brothers, about his father, who had been hard in the way of men who do not know how to be otherwise. She told him about the judge who had proposed to her, and why she had refused, not because of any deficiency in the judge, but because she had recognized that she would spend 40 years being the judge's wife in the way one wears a garment that fits adequately but that you did not choose. "What would you choose?" Nelson asked. She rode in silence for a moment, looking at the horizon, which was going pink at the edges with a sunset that was making the whole sky look like the inside of a seashell. "Something real," she said finally. "Whatever that costs." He thought about that for a long time. They returned to the ranch to find George Brenner in worse shape than when they had left. He had, in their absence, made a trip into Caldwell and had encountered Silas Drummond, and had, in a moment that was simultaneously pitiable and catastrophic, agreed in the presence of witnesses to an extension of the original loan that had added terms so punishing that Nelson, when Charlotte showed him the paper, felt the anger rise in him sharp and clean. He did not understand what he was signing, Charlotte said. Her voice was even. Her hands were not quite. He understood enough to sign it, Nelson said, and immediately regretted the bluntness. Charlotte set the paper down carefully on the kitchen table. He believed what Drummond told him. He always believes what people tell him. It is his worst quality and also in some ways his best one. She pressed both hands flat on the table. The new terms require the full note to be paid by the 1st of December, not March, December. "That is less than 2 weeks, Nelson said. 11 days, she said. He looked at her. He looked at the paper. He thought about Drummond, who he had met twice, a heavy man in a good coat who smiled with his mouth only, who had the frontier variety of power that came from controlling credit and water, and the one telegraph line that connected the county to the outside world. "I am going to talk to Drummond," Nelson said. "You are not," Charlotte said immediately. "He cannot legally." "He can legally," Charlotte said. "Your father signed a valid contract in front of 2 witnesses who will say whatever Drummond pays them to say. The territorial court in this county has not found against Drummond in 11 years. Going to talk to him will accomplish nothing except giving him the satisfaction of watching you fail." Nelson sat down in the chair across from her. The kitchen was quiet except for the wind outside, which was doing the thing it did in Kansas in late September, making itself known as a presence, a fact, an opinion. "Then what do we do?" he said. "I am going to the bank in Caldwell tomorrow," she said, "and I am going to propose to sell the south pasture to pay the note in full. It is not what I want. I had hoped to avoid it, but it is the only remaining option that does not involve losing everything. The south pasture has the best water." "I know what it has," she said quietly. He looked at her and said nothing, because what was there to say? She was right, and the mathematics were brutal, and she had arrived at the only available answer with the calm, clear-eyed practicality that he was beginning to understand. Was her most essential quality not coldness, never coldness, but the refusal to be destroyed by what was destroying her? The next morning he drove her into Caldwell in the wagon because her father was not capable of it. The bank in Caldwell was a 2-story building with a false front that made it look more substantial than it was, which was true of most things in a frontier town. The banker, a nervous man named Whitfield who clearly understood that his employment depended on Drummond's approval, received them with the particular brand of uncomfortable courtesy of someone who feels guilty and has decided not to. Charlotte presented her proposal. She was concise and documented, and had the land surveyor's assessment in her folder, which she had retrieved from her father's papers the night before. Whitfield listened. He pulled at his collar. He said he would need to consult with the primary stakeholder, meaning Drummond. He said he would have an answer by Friday. Charlotte said Friday was acceptable, and they left. 3 days passed. Nelson worked. Charlotte worked. George Brenner sat on the porch in the mornings and looked out at his land with the expression of a man who has begun to understand what he has done and cannot find a way to undo it. Nelson felt sorry for him and also angry with him, and also aware that both responses were inadequate to the actual complexity of a man, who was George Brenner, large-hearted and reckless and aware of his own failings, without being capable of correcting them. On Thursday evening, the foreman came to find Nelson in the barn and said there was trouble in town. He had heard from one of the Drummond hands, a man who had worked both operations and felt divided loyalties. that Drummond had already spoken to the land office and had begun the process of filing a foreclosure action, which meant the sale of the south pasture was being blocked. If the foreclosure went through, Drummond would acquire the entire property at the assessed distressed value, which was a fraction of what it was actually worth. Nelson saddled his horse and rode to the house and told Charlotte. She went still in the way she went still when something was serious, not frozen, but gathered, all her attention collected into a single point. "He cannot foreclose without serving notice," she said. "He has probably already served notice." "Your father," she was moving before he finished the sentence, going to her father's study, pulling papers from the desk with the efficient urgency of someone who has suspected this and prepared. She found the document at the bottom of a stack of mail, a formal notice of foreclosure action, served 2 days prior, that her father had apparently seen and then set down without telling anyone. Charlotte stood holding the paper. Something passed over her face that Nelson had not seen there before, not despair, but the thing just before despair, the moment when the distance between you and the ground becomes clear. "He does not know," she said quietly, meaning her father. "He truly does not understand what he put down." "Charlotte," Nelson said. She looked up at him. "There is one thing," he said, "that I have not said." She waited. "He had $640. It was not a number that most people in 1882 would consider remarkable. It was, in fact, every dollar he had saved in 4 years of hard labor on ranches across 3 territories, carried in a bank in Wichita under an account that nobody knew existed because Nelson had lived so frugally and so alone that the money had simply accumulated without his making any particular plan for it. He had no family to send it to. He had no property of his own. He had no idea when he was saving it what he was saving it for. He had wondered sometimes if he was simply giving himself the option, the long-delayed option, of doing something that mattered. He said, "I have $640 in a bank in Wichita." Charlotte looked at him. The full measure of what he was saying went across her face in stages. "Nelson," she said. "It covers the note," he said, "with $40 remaining, which is less impressive than it sounds but is technically a surplus. I cannot take your money." "You are not taking it," he said. "I am giving it." "That is the same thing." "It is absolutely not the same thing," he said, and there was something almost like heat in his voice, something that came from a place he did not often access, the place where his actual feelings lived when they were tired of being managed. "Charlotte, you have spent 4 months trying to save this ranch alone. You have done everything correctly and been outmaneuvered at every turn by a man with more leverage than conscience. And I have been here watching you, and I have the means to help, and I am offering to help, and I would very much appreciate it if you would let me." She was quiet for a long moment. The lamp on the desk threw a warm circle of light, and everything outside it was in shadow, and she looked at him across that warm circle with an expression that was not any single thing he could name. Gratitude, certainly, but also something more frightened and more tender and more complicated than gratitude. "Why?" she said simply. He held her gaze. He had been not saying things for months. He had been carefully, deliberately, consistently not saying the thing that was true. He looked at her in the lamplight and understood that not saying it was no longer an option, that the whole weight of who he was and what he had lost and what he might still have if he could simply stop being afraid of it had arrived at a point of no return. "Because I am not willing to watch you lose this," he said. "Because I would rather spend everything I have on something real than keep it for nothing." He paused. "You said you would choose something real, whatever it costs. I believe the same thing. I am just arriving at it later than you." She looked at him for a very long time. He stood very still. "The money will solve Drummond's claim," she said carefully, "but it does not address the underlying difficulty, which is that this ranch runs on margins thin enough that one bad season or one bad actor can undo everything." "I know," he said, "and you are proposing to—" She stopped, looked at him again. "Nelson, what exactly are you proposing?" And here it was. Here was the moment that he had been walking toward since June, Since the South Pasture fence, since the fire on the Abilene Drive, since the word trust. He was 39 years old, no, 29, though he often felt older, and he had said goodbye to every good thing that had come his way. He had developed a talent for it, a terrible facility, a habit so deep it had started to feel like character rather than fear. He said, "I am proposing that I use my savings to retire the note, and that you and I figure out the rest together, and that, if it is not too forward, and I accept that it may be too forward, I would like to be someone you figure it out with, going forward, in a permanent arrangement." The word permanent dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Charlotte Brenner, who was composed and practical and did not do things without thinking them through, said, "Are you asking me to marry you, Nelson Hadley?" "Yes," he said, "I am. Badly and without a proper preparation, and in a circumstance that is financially motivated on the surface and entirely genuinely felt beneath that surface, and I recognize that you have every reason to say no, and I will respect whatever you decide." Another silence. The lamp flickered slightly. "I will not say no," she said. He felt something happen to him then that he did not have adequate language for, something like being assembled. Something like a structure that had been in pieces for a long time suddenly finding its proper arrangement. He took a breath that went all the way down. "All right," he said, which was wholly inadequate to the moment, and she laughed a real laugh, surprised out of her, and it was the best sound he had ever heard in his life. But they had not resolved Drummond. And Drummond, as it turned out, was not going to simply accept a payment and go gracefully. Nelson wired for the money from Wichita the next morning. Telegrams were a recent enough miracle in Caldwell that the operator still took visible satisfaction in their dispatch, and the funds were confirmed for transfer by the end of the following day. But before the money could arrive, before the note could be retired, before any of the pieces could fall properly into place, Drummond made his move. Nelson had gone into Caldwell on Friday evening to confirm the wire at the bank, leaving Charlotte at the ranch. He had expected to be back within 2 hours. He had been in the bank for exactly 12 minutes when 3 of Drummond's men found him in the street outside and told him, politely but clearly, that Silas Drummond wanted a word. He went, because refusing felt like the worse option. Drummond's office was above the saloon he owned, up a flight of stairs that smelled of whiskey and old wood. Drummond was behind his desk, comfortable as a man who is accustomed to having rooms arranged to his advantage. "I hear you are planning to settle the Brenner note," Drummond said without preamble. "I am," Nelson said. "With what funds exactly?" "My own." Drummond looked at him with those flat, calculating eyes. "A ranch hand with $600, that is an interesting thing." "I have been saving a long time," Nelson said evenly. Drummond leaned back. "The thing is, Mr. Hadley, I do not want my note retired. I want the Brenner land. I have wanted it for 15 years. It has the best water access in the county, and I intend to have it, and I will not be thwarted by a ranch hand with a savings account and whatever arrangement he has made with George Brenner's daughter." "You will take the payment," Nelson said, "because the law requires you to accept it. The note terms specify that the full amount, paid in cleared funds before the 1st of December, satisfies the debt in full." "The funds will be here Monday." Drummond smiled. It was an unpleasant smile, the kind that precedes rather than follows something. "I want to show you something," he said. He opened a drawer and put a piece of paper on the desk. Nelson stepped forward and looked at it. It was a contract, the modified loan agreement that George Brenner had signed in September. There was a clause in it, buried in language that looked standard but was not, that gave Drummond first right of refusal on any third-party payment toward the note, meaning Drummond could refuse to accept Nelson's money. "Your father's attorney should have caught that," Drummond said pleasantly. "But George did not use an attorney, as you may have noticed. He trusts people." The smile did not change. "I am refusing the payment, Mr. Hadley. Inform Miss Brenner that I will be at the property Monday morning to take possession." Nelson looked at the paper. He looked at Drummond. Then he looked at the door. He walked down the stairs and back into the saloon below, moving very carefully in the way that a man moves when the thing he must not do is the thing every instinct is demanding. He sat down at the bar. He ordered a whiskey which he did not drink. He sat and thought. Drummond's clause was real. It might be challengeable in court on the grounds of unconscionable contract terms, but a court challenge took time, weeks, months, and the property would be in Drummond's possession by then. The clause was the trap that the whole arrangement had been building toward, patiently, over 15 years of waiting. He was sitting there, looking at the untouched whiskey glass, when 4 of Drummond's men came down the stairs. They were not subtle about their intentions. 2 of them stood at either exit, and 2 of them flanked Nelson at the bar. The lead man said, quietly, that Mr. Drummond wanted to make very sure that Nelson Hadley did not leave Caldwell and speak to Charlotte Brenner before Monday. Nelson understood then that Drummond wanted Charlotte isolated and without information when he arrived at the property. He wanted her to be unprepared, to be blindsided, to have no recourse and no ally present. He stood up. The man closest to him put a hand on his shoulder, and then the saloon doors opened and Charlotte Brenner walked in. That was the moment. The one from the very beginning of this story. The gun at his temple produced when his attempt to leave turned physical, and one of Drummond's men escalated further than the others intended, and Drummond himself came down from upstairs when he heard the commotion. The gun. The silence. Charlotte standing in the doorway in the late afternoon light like someone who has arrived precisely when and where they are needed by sheer force of knowing where to look. "Put it down, Silas," she said. "Whatever he owes you, I will pay it." And then the land deed, offered with the same calm certainty with which she did everything that mattered. Drummond lowered the gun, because he wanted the land, not a murder charge. Because even in 1882, even in a frontier county where Drummond's influence was enormous, there were limits to what a man could do in a room full of witnesses who might eventually talk. Because Charlotte had offered him what he wanted and he was too intelligent not to take it when it was offered to him at no cost. Nelson stepped away from the bar. The relief was physical, a loosening through his whole body that made him feel temporarily unsteady. Drummond looked at Charlotte. "The deed," he said. "Witnessed and signed," she said, "in exchange for the signed release of my father's note and your written surrender of any claim to the property." "You do not have the deed with you," Drummond said. "I do," Charlotte said. She reached into the front of her coat and produced a folded document, and Nelson understood in that moment that she had known. She had known, or suspected closely enough to prepare, that Drummond would use the refusal clause, and she had come to town not to rescue Nelson, though she had done that too, but to make the final move in a game she had been studying for months. She had ridden to town with the deed and walked into the saloon, and offered Drummond the one thing he wanted more than the larger property, because she had decided that a clean exit on her own terms was better than a prolonged fight she might lose. "The south pasture," Drummond said, looking at the deed. "The south pasture, 112 acres of the best water access on the property, not the whole ranch, enough to satisfy him, enough to buy freedom from him." "The south pasture," Charlotte confirmed, "including the water rights to the lower creek, signed and dated today." Drummond considered. His eyes moved from the deed to Charlotte to Nelson and back. He was calculating, always calculating, and what he calculated was that the south pasture was worth more than what remained of the note, that he was coming out ahead, and that further pressure in a room full of witnesses with a dead man's daughter standing absolutely unafraid in front of him was not his best play. "All right," he said. He signed the release. Charlotte signed the deed. The saloon keeper, looking as though he would have preferred to be anywhere else, witnessed both documents. Drummond took the deed and left without another word, because men like Drummond do not make speeches when the transaction is complete. They simply take what they came for and go. The room breathed. Nelson stood beside Charlotte and looked at her and said very quietly, "You knew about the refusal clause." "I suspected there was something like it," she said. "My father is a trusting man, Drummond is not. There is almost always a trap in an arrangement between those two types. You came to trade the south pasture. I came to end it, she said. Cleanly, today, the south pasture is land. The ranch, the house, the north pasture, the east pasture, the barn, the well is home. You can rebuild without water rights to the lower creek. You cannot rebuild from nothing. He looked at her for a long moment. The saloon was emptying around them, men finding excuses to be elsewhere, the drama concluded and the ordinary business of a Friday evening reasserting itself. Charlotte, he said. Yes, she said. I said I wanted to figure things out with you going forward. You did, she said. I meant it. I know you did, she said. And then, because she was Charlotte Brenner and did not do things incompletely. So did I. They rode back to the ranch in the dark, side by side, not talking very much, with the stars coming out over the Kansas plain in the extravagant, unhurried way that stars come out when there is nothing between you and the sky. The road was familiar and the horses knew it. Nelson rode with his shoulder close enough to hers that he could feel the warmth of her even through the October chill. He reached across and took her hand, which was resting on the saddle horn, and held it. She turned her hand and held his back. They rode home like that. George Brenner, when told of the resolution, the south pasture gone but the note retired, the threat of Drummond concluded, went through a sequence of emotions that was difficult to watch and clearly necessary. He wept. He apologized to Charlotte with a directness and depth that suggested he had understood more of what he had done than he had let on. He shook Nelson's hand and then, with the unguarded affection that was perhaps the best of him, gripped Nelson's arm with both hands and said, "Thank you for what you did for my girl." Nelson said, "She did most of it herself." George looked at his daughter and smiled, the real smile, the one that reached his eyes and made him look like the younger man he must have been before grief and loss and bad decisions had accumulated, and said, "Yes, she always does." Charlotte and Nelson were married in November of 1882. The ceremony was in the Caldwell Church, which was a small building that smelled of pine sap and candle wax, and the combined prayers of a frontier congregation who took their religion seriously because hard country made the metaphysical feel necessary. The Reverend was a compact man named Patterson who had buried more people than he had married, and who therefore performed weddings with extra care, as though making up for the deficit. He read the words carefully. He meant them. Charlotte wore a dress that had been her mother's altered to fit her different height and slightly different shape, made of deep blue wool that turned her gray eyes to something between slate and silver. She had let her hair down, which was the first time Nelson had seen it fully loose, and it fell in dark red waves past her shoulders, and he had to remind himself to pay attention to what Reverend Patterson was saying. He wore his best clothes, which were not remarkable, but Charlotte had looked at him in them, and something in her face had gone warm and quiet in a way that made him feel, against all prior evidence, like a man worth looking at. They said the words. He put a ring on her finger, a simple gold band, purchased in Wichita when he had gone to close the savings account, which seemed like a different life now, though it had been only weeks. She looked at the ring on her hand, and then at him, and the look on her face was the look from Abilene, the real smile, unguarded, reaching everything. He kissed her, there in the small church, with the Reverend and George Brenner and the foreman and two of the ranch hands watching, and it was a careful kiss, not because he was not feeling it, but because there was so much feeling in it that careful seemed like the right approach to something that large. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was the kind that settled arguments about whether frontier life was romantic. It was not romantic in the way that novels described. It was cold and difficult and relentless, the wind finding every gap in the ranch house walls, the water pump freezing in February, the cattle requiring constant checking in a cold that went into the negative numbers for weeks at a time. Nelson and Charlotte worked through it as they worked through everything together, with a practical division of labor that was not particularly romantic in its execution and was completely romantic in its essence, because There was nothing more intimate than the daily decision to keep showing up for someone. They also, in the quiet evenings when the wind let up and the fire was going, and they were sitting at the kitchen table, Charlotte with her account books, Nelson repairing tack, or simply reading the one newspaper they received, talked. They talked the way that people talk when they are still learning each other and want to learn everything. She told him things she had not told anyone. He told her things he had kept so long they had started to feel like parts of him he could not share. He told her about the morning after Grace died, the ride west, the determination to keep moving because stopping meant acknowledging what had happened. He told her about the specific quality of that loneliness, the way it had not been dramatic or spectacular but simply the background condition of every subsequent day, a kind of permanent weather you stopped noticing because it never changed. Charlotte listened with her full attention, which was the kind of attention that made you feel heard in a very precise and rare way. She said when he finished, "I am glad you kept moving." "Why?" he asked. "Because," she said, "the direction you kept moving was west. And west is here." She looked at him steadily. "I am glad you arrived here." Nelson looked at her across the kitchen table in the firelight and felt the same thing he had felt the night he had held her hand on the ride home from Caldwell. Not the explosive feeling of falling, but the deep, structural feeling of having been caught, of being held by something solid, of arriving somewhere that was not a waypoint. She was not Grace. He did not want her to be Grace. What he had with Charlotte was its own thing, sharp and equal, and built on the actual texture of who they both were, not on the younger, less formed versions of themselves who might have loved differently. It was the love of two people who had survived enough to know what survival costs and what it is worth, who had chosen each other with open eyes and open histories, and the clear knowledge that nothing is guaranteed. He was grateful for every hard thing that had brought him to this kitchen. Spring came to Kansas the way spring comes, tentatively at first, with false starts that made you think it had given up, and then all at once, with a generosity that felt like apology for everything February had done. The grass came back, the creek came back. George Brenner, who had spent the winter in a kind of quiet penitence that seemed to be doing him genuine good, came back too, started working again, carefully, alongside Nelson, rebuilding the relationship between himself and the ranch on different terms than the ones he had used before. He stopped gambling, not dramatically or with declaration, but simply stopped, the way men sometimes stop things when the cost has been made undeniably visible. He went to church. He talked less about things working out and more about making them work, which was a subtle difference but an important one. Charlotte watched this with cautious hope, which was the correct and appropriate response to a man who had a history that required watching, and also with a love for him that had never actually diminished, that had simply been surviving alongside the frustration. Nelson observed the whole family and understood for the first time in his adult life what it felt like to be part of one. Charlotte confirmed, in April, that she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, early, before the rest of the house was awake, out on the porch in the cold April light with a cup of coffee in her hands, and the look on her face of someone who has processed a very large piece of information and arrived at a feeling about it but is not entirely sure it is appropriate to show the feeling yet. Nelson set his own cup down very carefully on the porch railing and turned to look at her. "A child," he said. "By October, I think," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he stepped forward and took the coffee cup gently from her hands and set it beside his own and put both arms around her, and she stood very still for one breath, and then she leaned into him, and he felt her exhale completely for the first time in as long as he had known her. "All right," he said softly, into her hair. She made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else entirely. "Just all right." "Everything I actually feel is too large to say in one morning," he said. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her hands on his arms, and her face was the most open he had ever seen it. All the composure and the management and the careful containment gone, just Charlotte, just this, just now. "Good," she said. "Same." The spring was busy in the practical way that spring on a cattle ranch is always busy calving season, which was relentless and required someone present at nearly all hours. Fence inspection after the winter's damage, soil preparation, ordering supplies for the coming year. Nelson and Charlotte worked through it with George, now a genuine part of the labor rather than an absent figurehead, and the ranch began to feel different. Not fixed exactly, because the loss of the south pasture had permanently changed what was possible, but stable, purposeful, like a thing that had been through a fire and was building on the cleared ground. Charlotte, as her pregnancy advanced, did not slow down as much as Nelson would have liked her to, which was to say, she slowed down not at all for the first 4 months and only marginally after that. They argued about this, in the way that two people with equally strong convictions argue, which is to say firmly and without resolution, because neither of them was going to convince the other of something the other had already decided. He worried. She found his worry endearing and excessive in roughly equal measure. The summer was good. Nelson rode the ranch each morning and felt, every single morning, the clean novelty of a feeling he had not had before, contentment that did not come with the internal asterisk of waiting for it to end. He had spent so long anticipating loss that the absence of that anticipation felt almost like a new sense, something he was still learning to use. He planted a kitchen garden behind the house that summer, which was not practical for a man who had never done it before, but which Charlotte supported without mockery and with occasional instruction. He grew tomatoes and beans, and something he believed were squash that turned out to be a variety he did not recognize. He brought them to the kitchen table in September with a pride that was entirely sincere, and Charlotte cooked them and said they were excellent. He told her later that he was not sure they were excellent. She said, "I know, I thought you needed the encouragement." He said, "I appreciate that." She said, "I know you do." There was, in the ordinary pleasures of that summer, a quality he had no adequate word for in the language of men who are accustomed to talking about hardship but not abundance. Rightness, maybe, the feeling of a thing that has found its correct arrangement. Their son was born on the 3rd of October, 1883, in the ranch house, delivered by a midwife who came from town and who was experienced and brisk, and said afterward that Charlotte was the most composed woman she had ever delivered, and that she meant it as a compliment. Charlotte, who had been composed all the way through, and whom Nelson had held the hand of for 6 hours in the small bedroom, while the October wind came in through the window and the midwife worked, was less composed when the baby arrived than at any previous point in her life. She cried. Nelson had not expected that, not because it was unreasonable, but because Charlotte did not often cry, and when she did it quietly and privately, and this was neither quiet nor private. He held his son in his arms and felt something that had no comparison to anything that had come before it. Something that went all the way through him like light through glass, total, transforming, leaving him different in shape on the other side. They named him James George Hadley, James for Nelson's brother, George for the man looking through the doorway with his hands on the frame and his eyes bright and red, who said, when Nelson brought the baby to him, "He is a fine boy," in a voice that was not steady at all. George Brenner lived 4 more years, and they were 4 good years. He was present for them in a way he had not been for Charlotte's childhood, awake, engaged, participating. He took an interest in young James with the fierce, uncomplicated delight of a grandfather who knows what time is and does not intend to waste it. He told the boy stories. He taught him to whittle badly, which was somehow more endearing than if he had done it well. He worked the ranch until the winter of 1887, when a cough that started in December did not stop, and he died in February of 1888 in his own bed, with Charlotte on one side of him and Nelson on the other, and little James, 4 years old and not entirely understanding, asleep in the next room. Charlotte sat with her father's hand in hers for a long time after he was gone. Nelson sat beside her. He did not speak. He had learned in these years with her that there are kinds of grief that do not want words and that the most useful thing another person can do is remain. He remained. They buried George Brenner in the small cemetery outside Caldwell, next to his wife, which was where he had always said he wanted to be. The Reverend said good things. They were true. George Brenner had been reckless and kind and capable of great warmth and of extraordinary failure, and he had loved his daughter with a constancy that outlasted his failings, and he was mourned. Charlotte grieved with the same quality she brought to everything fully, without performing it, in her own time. Nelson watched her come through it the way he had come through his own losses, the same long season of missing, the same gradual restoration of forward motion. He was there for all of it. That was the whole of his job, and he was not bad at it. James grew. He had his mother's gray eyes and his father's steadiness and his grandfather George's laugh, which appeared in him around age 3 and which was loud and delighted and arrived on no particular schedule, which kept surprising everyone around him. He loved horses with the totality of a small child who has found the thing that fits exactly, would sit on the fence of the corral and watch them for an hour without being told to, which was remarkable for a child who could not be made to sit still for anything else. Nelson taught him to ride at 5. Charlotte watched from the fence with her arms folded, and her face doing its careful but feeling expression, which Nelson could read perfectly by now, had been reading for years. She was terrified. She would not say so. She watched James ride in small, careful circles in the corral and did not say a single word that was not encouraging. "You can say you are worried," Nelson told her afterward. "I am not worried," she said. "Charlotte. He is an excellent rider," she said firmly. "He is 5 years old." "He is an excellent 5-year-old rider," she said. Nelson did not pursue it. He was smiling. In 1886, Charlotte became pregnant again. She told him on the porch again in the morning again, but this time she was smiling when she did it, the real smile, the one that had no reserve in it. "Again," Nelson said. "Again," she confirmed. He pulled her close right there on the porch without ceremony, in the morning light, with the coffee going cold on the railing, and she laughed into his shoulder. Their second child, a daughter, was born in January of 1887, in the middle of a blizzard that made the midwife's journey from town, an adventure she described afterward as the most alarming of her professional life. They named her Margaret after Nelson's mother, who had been a quiet woman he remembered in fragments. Her hands, her voice, the smell of the bread she made on Sundays. Charlotte had asked what name he would choose for a daughter, and he had said Margaret without quite meaning to, the name rising from somewhere deep and involuntary, and Charlotte had said, "Then Margaret it is." Margaret arrived in January and immediately had opinions about everything, which she expressed with great confidence despite being unable to say words. James, 3 years older, received her with a seriousness that Nelson found both touching and comical, would crouch beside her cradle and watch her with the focused attention of someone who has taken on a significant responsibility. The ranch by 1887 was not what it had been in the Drummond years. The south pasture was gone, the margins were thinner, the work was unrelenting, but it was theirs in a way that felt complete and uncontested. They had rebuilt the cattle herd carefully, selecting for hardiness, and had added a small horse operation that was Charlotte's idea, and that turned out to be considerably more profitable than either of them had projected, because Charlotte's sense of what the market wanted was, as with most things she turned her attention to, accurate. Drummond himself had a turn of fortune in 1885 that gave Nelson quiet satisfaction without his having done anything to cause it. The railroad company, expanding a spur line west, had exercised eminent domain over a portion of his property, and the legal fight that followed had cost Drummond considerably in both money and attention. He sold 3 of his cattle operations and retreated to a property in Colorado, and Caldwell gradually stopped being his territory in any operational sense. He did not vanish entirely, men like Drummond rarely did, but he became a background figure, A cautionary story, the name you invoked when explaining why you read contracts carefully. Nelson read contracts very carefully. He had also, by 1888, begun something he had not expected of himself: teaching. He had no credentials for it, no formal training, but the schoolteacher in the county school had left for Kansas City, and there was a gap in the fall that nobody was filling, and Charlotte had said, one evening with characteristic directness, "You should offer." He had looked at her and said he was not a schoolteacher. She had said, "You know how to read, write, calculate, and explain things clearly. That is what a schoolteacher is." He had gone and offered. He taught the winter session of 1888. He was not a natural teacher in the theatrical sense. He did not perform or entertain or make the schoolroom feel like a circus. But he was patient in a way that the children responded to, and he explained things from multiple angles until understanding arrived, and he treated the children as intelligent people who were simply missing information, which made a measurable difference in how they received what he taught. He taught through 1889 as well, while also managing the ranch, which was an arrangement that required significant energy, but that gave him something he had not known to name until he had it, a sense of purpose that was larger than his own household. Charlotte supported the teaching operation with the same full commitment she gave to everything she decided to support, which meant she covered additional ranch work without complaint, helped him prepare lessons when he was uncertain, and on one occasion rode into town to deliver a forgotten set of materials to the schoolhouse herself, because he had left them on the kitchen table and she happened to notice. She did not make a large thing of it. She simply did it. That was, Nelson thought, the whole character of her. She simply did the thing, without needing it to be witnessed or credited or acknowledged. She did the thing because it was what was needed and she was the person there, and that was enough. He told her this one evening in 1889 in October, when James was 6 and Margaret was 2, and they were sitting on the porch in the cool evening while the children were inside with George Brenner. No, George was gone by then. It was the foreman's wife who minded the children, sometimes sitting on the porch, his arm around her shoulders, watching the last light go out of the sky over the Kansas plain. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. She knew his registers by now, knew the difference between the voice that meant a practical conversation and the voice that meant something real. "I spent a long time," he said, "saying goodbye to things." He paused, organizing it, because this was the kind of thing he wanted to say correctly. "I got good at it. I got so good at it that I stopped noticing I was doing it. I thought I was being realistic. I thought I was protecting myself from loss by not holding on too tight. And what I was actually doing," he stopped. "What were you actually doing?" she asked softly. "Throwing things away," he said, "before they could be taken, so it felt like a choice rather than a loss." He looked at the darkening sky. "When you walked into that saloon, when you put yourself between me and that gun, I knew I was not going to say goodbye to you. I did not decide it, I just knew." Charlotte was quiet beside him for a moment. The night was coming in from the east, as it always came, gradually and then completely. "You never said goodbye to me," she said. "No," he said, "even when it would have been easier. Especially then." She turned and looked at him fully, with those gray eyes that had looked at him across fences and fires and financial ruin and grief, and had never once looked away from anything true. "Nelson," she said. "Yes," he said. "I would walk into that saloon every single time," she said. He looked at her. The weight of it, the whole 7 years of it, the hard winter and the south pasture and George's death and James and Margaret, and the mornings and the evenings and the ordinary daily choosing of each other, was present in her face, carried there without cost, the way she carried everything she loved. He kissed her on the porch in the October dark, and it was not the careful kiss of the church. It was the kiss of two people who know each other completely and still want what they know. The years continued. They did not stop for the romance, as years never do, and the romance did not stop for the years, which is rarer. James Hadley grew into a young man who had his mother's intelligence and his father's patience, and a gift for horses that seemed to come from somewhere entirely his own. At 17, he was running the horse breeding operation with a confidence that made Charlotte look at Nelson, with an expression of contained pride that Nelson found moving every single time. At 18, he had a girl from town, a sensible, kind young woman named Anna Vickers, who rode over on Sundays and whose presence made James visibly calmer, which was the best possible sign. Margaret grew up opinionated and physical and possessed of a restless energy that kept everyone around her alert. She had Nelson's dark coloring and Charlotte's precision of thought and a combined stubbornness that, according to Charlotte, was entirely from Nelson's side, and according to Nelson, was entirely from Charlotte's, and that both of them secretly took pride in. She learned to read earlier than James had, learned to ride earlier, and at 11 had presented a coherent argument for why the ranch should expand into hog farming that included 3 pages of market research she had compiled herself from newspapers. They did not expand into hog farming. Nelson thought about it. In 1894, Charlotte was 40 years old and Nelson was 41, and they were standing together in the doorway of the ranch house on a spring evening watching James and Anna, who were engaged now, working in the corral together. Margaret was behind them in the kitchen doing something that involved a great deal of clattering and what appeared to be a culinary experiment of uncertain safety. Charlotte was leaning against the door frame and Nelson was behind her, his arm around her waist, his chin very nearly resting on her shoulder because he was tall enough to do it easily, and because he liked the angle, the view of her face in profile, the way the evening light caught the dark red of her hair, which had a thread or two of gray now that she wore with the same unceremonious acceptance with which she wore everything. 12 years, she said. 12 years, he confirmed. That went, she started. I know, he said. I was not going to say fast, she said. I was going to say fully. He thought about that. Yes, he said, fully is the right word. She turned her head slightly toward him. Are you content, Nelson? The question was genuine. She always asked the real questions, never the polished versions. He thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. Content is too small, he said. I am more than content. That is not grammatically clear, she said. It is emotionally accurate, he said. She made the sound that was almost a laugh. He loved that sound. He had been collecting that sound for 12 years. The supper that came from Margaret's clattering experiment that evening was, against all reasonable expectation, quite good, a stew of some variety that she served with a satisfaction that dared anyone to criticize it. Nelson ate 2 bowls. James ate 3, and Anna laughed at him. George Brenner was present in the way that the dead are present in the houses they loved, in the chair by the fire that no one quite managed to sit in comfortably, in the expressions that passed through Charlotte's face when something happened that would have delighted him, in James's laugh. Charlotte told a story about her father after supper, one Nelson had not heard before, about George taking her to the fair in Wichita when she was 8 and losing their buggy money playing cards, and then winning it back again plus enough extra to buy her a candy that she had not been allowed, and that had been the best day of her childhood. She told it with the mixed feeling that a person tells stories about someone who made their life both harder and richer than it might otherwise have been, with love that did not require the person to have been uncomplicated. Nelson listened and watched her face and loved her in the particular way he had learned to love her, which was not the way of early love, not that brilliant, consuming, anxious thing that needs constant reassurance, but the way of love that has survived enough to know its own weight and carry it without effort. The summer of 1895 brought something unexpected. Drummond's agent, not Drummond himself, who had died in Colorado the prior winter, but his agent appeared in Caldwell with papers relating to Drummond's estate, and a claim that the original sale of the South pasture had involved a clerical error in the deed that potentially rendered the transfer incomplete. The agent wanted to negotiate. He arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning and spoke to Nelson on the porch. Nelson listened to everything he said with the patience of a man who has heard this particular type of approach before and knows exactly what it is. Then he went inside and got Charlotte. Charlotte came out on the porch in the plain working dress she wore in the mornings, her hair back, her account book under one arm because she had been at figures when he interrupted her. She looked at the agent. She looked at the papers he extended. "The deed is valid," she said, before she had finished reading the first page. "I drew it up myself with reference to the statutes in effect in 1882, and it was witnessed and filed correctly. If there is a clerical error in your copy, the error is in your copy." The agent said that he had a legal opinion to the contrary. Charlotte said that he was welcome to test that legal opinion in the territorial court, where the filed deed and the witness records were available for examination, and that she looked forward to the proceeding. The agent said that this could take considerable time and expense for all parties. Charlotte said that she was not particularly concerned about her time or expense on this matter, and that if he would like to save his own, he should consider returning to wherever he came from and leaving the Hadley ranch alone. The agent went away. They did not hear from Drummond's estate again. Nelson waited until the agent's buggy was out of sight and then turned to Charlotte and said, "Thank you." She said it was not complicated. He said, "I know. I still wanted to say thank you." She looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved. "You are welcome," she said, and went back inside to her account book. James and Anna married in June of 1896 in the same Caldwell church where Nelson and Charlotte had married 14 years before, with Reverend Patterson's successor, a younger man named Clark who had the same care with his words, reading the same service. Margaret, 13 and in a dress she had fought against wearing with considerable energy, sat beside Charlotte and held her hand and did not, as far as Nelson could see, cry, because she had announced that crying at weddings was a sentimental convention she did not subscribe to. Charlotte cried, quietly, quickly, and without calling any particular attention to it. Nelson found her hand and held it. "Fully," he said quietly, reminding her. She looked at him. "Fully," she agreed. Their grandchildren arrived in the years that followed. James and Anna had 3 boys in 6 years, which was an abundance that filled the ranch house on Sundays with a noise that was extraordinary. Margaret, who had gone to a school in Kansas City for 2 years and come back with a teaching certificate and more opinions than she had left with, which seemed impossible, established herself as the county school teacher, and remained deeply unmarried in the way of a woman who has made a decision about her own life and is content with it. Until 1901, when she met a veterinarian named Thomas Aldrich who had come to Caldwell following the railroad and who was apparently the first person she had encountered who could keep up with her in an argument. They were engaged within 6 months. Charlotte, told the news, smiled the full smile and said that she had suspected. Nelson said he had not suspected at all. Charlotte said, "I know you did not." He said, "That is not. You are very observant about most things," she said pleasantly. "Not about this kind of thing. You never were. I noticed that before we were married." He thought about it. "Fair," he said. "Thank you," she said. The turn of the century came without particular ceremony on the Hadley ranch. They were not people who needed ceremonies to mark time, who kept track of the years in ways that required celebration. They kept track in other ways. In the height of James's boys, measured against the door frame in the kitchen that James had marked his own heights on as a child. In the accumulation of good seasons and less good ones that had made the ranch stable in the way of a thing that has been tested enough to know what it is made of. In the conversations they still had at the kitchen table, still late, still the lamp going low, still Charlotte with her books and Nelson with whatever was in his hands, and the comfort of that, the exact specific comfort of that particular arrangement, which was not a thing you could describe to someone who had not experienced it, but that was the most purely valuable thing Nelson Hadley possessed. He thought sometimes about the man he had been in 1882. The man who kept moving, because stopping meant acknowledging what he had lost. The man who had mistaken endurance for living, who had built his life around absence rather than presence, who had been so good at goodbye that he had almost said it to the best thing he had ever found. He was grateful, in the way of a man who has been given more than he deserved and knows it, for the moment he had chosen differently. For the saloon and the gun and Charlotte walking through the door with a land deed and the absolute flat certainty that she was going to solve this, whatever it cost. For the 11 years that had followed and the years that were still coming. For Margaret in the schoolhouse and James with his horses and the grandsons who arrived on Sundays like a small natural disaster and left everything better than they had found it. For the woman sitting across the kitchen table from him on a Tuesday evening in October 1901, gray in her dark red hair and reading glasses she had recently and reluctantly acquired, making notes in her account book with the efficient attention of someone who has been doing this for 20 years and has not lost interest in doing it correctly. She looked up and found him watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She looked at him over the glasses with the specific expression she had for when he was being sentimental and not saying so. "Nelson," she said. "Fully," he said. A pause, the lamp between them. The sound of the wind outside, which was the same wind it had always been, the Kansas wind that never stopped, that he had stopped hearing as lonely and started hearing as simply the sound of where he lived. Charlotte put down her pen. She looked at him across the table, across everything. Across the South pasture and the saloon and Abilene, and the hard winters and Grace's name in the firelight and James's first cry and George's last breath and all of it, and she said, "Fully." She reached across the table and took his hand. He held it the way he had held it the first time, on the road home from Caldwell in the dark, with the stars overhead and the horses knowing the way and everything in front of them still unknown but chosen. He held it with the same care, the same certainty, the same feeling of having arrived somewhere real and intending to stay. He had said goodbye to every good thing that came his way. He had not said it this time. And in the warm kitchen of the Hadley ranch outside Caldwell, Kansas, with the lamp burning low and the October wind doing its ancient, indifferent work outside, with his son's family a short ride away, and his daughter falling in love with someone who deserved her, and the plain outside wide and dark, and enduring in its beauty, Nelson Hadley held his wife's hand and understood that some things, the real things, the things that hold, do not require a goodbye. They require only the courage to stay.